welcome back. Today I'm going to show you guys step 4 through 5. At this point you should have your Snickers or Three Musketeers or Pop Rocks or whatever candy that you're drawing all laid out onto your 9x12 watercolor paper. Okay, if you have this handy dandy steps and materials list, you can scroll through to step 4, and I'm going to walk you guys through these, and I'm going to make a separate video just showing you guys some tips and tricks to help you with the painting process, because watercolor is pretty unforgiving. Once you put it down on paper, that's really it, so you have to plan before you start painting, okay? And that's where these little cards come in handy, because you can use these to kind of test out your colors before putting it on the final work. So these are the materials that you're going to need. Make sure that you have your 9x12 watercolor paper. Make sure that you have your still life. I'm looking for you guys to accurately be mixing colors and transferring that into your final watercolor painting. So you got to look at what you're painting in order to do that. You're also going to need your watercolor palette. There is a brush that is inside of it. Hopefully you guys follow my recommendation to take your other brushes home with you. You're going to need some type of container to hold water. Containers, as far as holding water, I would use something that's recyclable, that you're not going to eat out of again. And even though these are non-toxic paints, you know, I try to keep my art materials separate from my food containers, because you really shouldn't be eating this kind of stuff, and you don't want to have any residual paint or, you know, those kind of residues inside of your drinking vessels, or eating vessels. So you're also going to need some paper towels, so make sure that you take those out, and that's about it. And once you have those things, you can go ahead and get started. Now, when you're adding your color, the best thing to do is add water slowly to the paint, okay? And I like to test out my paint every single time before I put it onto my final artwork. And also to think about the brushes that you're using. If you're painting a large area, for example, I have, you know, the shadow area that's in here, I might want to use a larger brush. If I'm painting something that's more detailed, you know, like the lettering, I might want to use a thinner brush, okay? So play around with your brushes. You probably won't need a fan brush. I can't imagine that you would, but maybe. I mean, if it suits you. You guys kind of experiment and explore which brushes work best for you. Okay, so I'm going to get started and start painting this. I'll speed it up as we go along. And another thing that I wanted to remind you of is, if your tray is dirty, take a piece of damp paper towel and just put it in the tray just to loosen up that paint. And that'll soak it right on up. There we go. See, and now it's nice and clean for the next color that you want to mix in there. I'm going to leave the blue there because I know that I'm going to be using that for my Snickers candy bar, you know, logo that's on there. Another thing too is watercolors, you normally don't just paint them all in one sitting. Many watercolor artists paint over several days, and the reason why is because it's watercolor loves water. So if you have an area that's wet and then you paint another different color that's wet next to it, they tend to bleed together. So give yourself plenty of time to do this. You should be on the next stage of painting. So you should be painting today, tomorrow. Remember I said to you know, work about 20 minutes a day on your projects. This is going to be due next week. On the 31st. I believe I put it on Facebook, but if I didn't, it's due next Tuesday, okay? So try to keep up. If you are behind, because I know distance learning is a little challenging, that's okay. Don't worry about it. You know, we'll work that out later on. Just email me and let me know, okay? Because I'd rather get an email from you now that says, you know, I'm behind on this, than you telling me when we come back on the 19th that you didn't do anything at all, or you don't have this done or that done. That way we can kind of plan ahead. Okay, so to get started, what I like to do is I pick like a color that I want to paint first. Oh, one more tip. Make sure that you have a light source that's shining on your project, I'm just gonna scoot this over a little bit because I had a really nice shadow that was in here. Oh, another thing too, is I traced all of my the positions of all of my wrappers so that in case if they blew off, or if I didn't have glue to glue it down, you know, I can pretty much get them back into the same position that they were in to begin with. So what I would do is draw out your shadows. I had this really nice shadow that was underneath here yesterday. I also had a really nice shadow underneath this one that was casted. Another good thing to do is block out your highlight areas, and the reason why is because when you're adding white to watercolor, there's no white in your palette, so you have to use the white of your paper. This has to go out with, you know, you're planning ahead. So one thing that I like to use is tape, and if you don't have tape at home, that's okay. Another thing you can do too is use white crayon. So if you have a white crayon at home and you just block out like where those white highlights are, or if you have, for example, I have some white that's in my text, but I'm probably going to use some grays here and there because I do see some shadows in there. But particularly highlights, you know, if you have a highlight, I have one that's down here. You know, I might want to put tape down. Now make sure you stick your tape to your clothing before you stick it onto your paper. That'll prevent it from ripping. And I'm using painter's tape, but you can use regular, like, you know, Scotch tape. Just make sure you stick it to your clothes real good a few times before you go ahead and, you know, start using it. And I'm just going to rip these into just the basic shape of the highlights that are there. And then I'm going to place them down. If it wants to place down for me, come on. There we go. Whoop, nope. I'm cutting them up really small. Now don't forget those highlights. I want to see those in your final drawing. It makes it look realistic. If you go back to your rubric on Google Classroom, or even if you have it on you, you know, those images, those examples that I included, they have really great realism because they have highlights, they have low mid-tones, which is kind of like between, you know, that neutral gray, it's between black and white. They also have some really nice shadows and that kind of stuff in there too. So I'm looking around, I see one that's on the edge here, but it's really thin, so I'm just gonna paint that in. And there's also some really nice highlights that are here. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started with my mixing. Now, can you use colors straight out of the palette? Yes, you can. Remember I said to stay away from black. I'm going to show you guys some other options for that. I would say that 90% of the time, this color that's in your palette, even though I'm looking at brown because I have a lot of brown in mine, it's not the brown that's on the actual wrapper. These are very rich pigments, almost straight out of the rainbow. In life, it's very rare that you're going to find that, especially in something that's been manufactured, like a candy bar, a poster, that kind of thing. They normally have specific, you know, color choices that they use. So if you do use this brown, you know, maybe you might, you know, as I wet it, it looks really, really light. I'm going to put a little bit on here. How about, I'm going to start over here. And I'm using a small brush to paint this in. And it doesn't, to me, it doesn't look dark enough. So what I might want to do is darken it a little bit, but how do I do that without adding black? Well, there's a couple different things that you can do. Cool colors in particular, I'm talking about your purples, your blues, your greens, they tend to recede. What that means is they go back into the distance, or they appear to be farther away from you. And normally shadows are the farthest thing that are away from you, right? This wrapper is sitting on top of the shadow that it's casting underneath it. So if I want to create a really nice shadow, I might mix a cool color in with the color that I'm using. Okay, so make sure that you're mixing on your palette, not on your artwork. So I'm going to put my brown in here, and I'm going to make enough of it. And if you brush your brush along the edges of the lid, it helps release some of that color. I'm going to clean off my brush in between colors, and I'm going to go into blue, and I'll show you what this is going to do. Yeah, it muddies it a little bit. And then I'm going to go back in, and now I'm going to put in that darker color. And to me, that looks a little bit more like the color of the wrapper. Okay, all right. So if I'm doing brown, I might paint my whole thing brown first, and then go into my next color that I'll be using. You know, give it some time to dry. Or, you know, you can start painting in one area and then kind of hop and skip around. Just don't paint colors that are next to each other. For example, if I'm going to add a little bit more of this lighter color to it, because as I get to the top, it gets a little bit lighter in value. So if I paint this area here right up against the red line, also too, notice I'm not dousing my paper with tons and tons of water. You know, and I start painting this in, I would not then go take my red and start painting in this area. And the reason why is because if I do that, right, I'll show you on the card here. If I take my red, put that down, and then I take, you know, some brown, and put that down next to it. See, the colors all bleed together, and you don't get sharp, nice, crisp lines. So don't paint wet colors next to each other. Give them some time to dry. Okay, so that's my first tip. Another tip is if you want water to go into a particular area, like you only want it to go in the, how about I draw it out with a pencil here? You know, say I have, you know, a square and there's a circle in it, but I only want the color inside the circle. What you can do is take a damp, clean brush with a little bit of water on it and just paint the area that you want to obtain the color. And then if you kind of working in here, what will happen, I need a little bit more pigment. What will happen is the color will stay in that area. Okay, because remember, watercolor loves water, so it's going to go wherever the water is. All right, you might have to work it around in there a little bit, but that's another tip for painting. Okay, so I'm going to keep on painting this, and I wish you guys the best of luck.